Arizin, a young mother, was caught on camera abandoning her 4-year-old daughter at a hospital in an attempt to get rid of the child. The reason? She wanted to spend more time with her boyfriend. When the child's paternal grandmother revealed the girl's inheritance, the young mother hurried back, demanding custody. So, what the elderly woman did was unprecedented. Sitting on a hospital bed, Lexi could only feel fear. It was a normal environment, doctors attending to patients and nurses bustling around. However, everything seemed terrifying to the child, and she began to cry, covering her eyes with her little hands. After a few minutes, Sophia Conway, a nurse, approached the child. "Hi, sweetheart, are you okay? Where are your parents?" she asked. Lexi, only 4 years old, just looked at Sophia, still with red eyes. The nurse looked around and saw no one, so she asked the girl again, "Where's your mommy, sweetie?" But Lexi's response was confused. She just babbled some incomprehensible words. Sophia then picked the girl up and took her to the reception to better understand the situation. And as she walked, she had no idea how serious it all was. An hour earlier, Edson Smith, Lexi's mother, had arrived at the hospital with the girl in her arms. She walked quickly and avoided looking anyone in the eye. Taking advantage of the chaotic atmosphere, she took the girl to an empty hospital bed and sat her down. Lexi looked at her mother with bright, confused eyes and started crying when she turned her back and walked out of the room, frightened. Lexi reached out her little arms towards Arizin and said, in her childish voice, "Mommy, don't go. I'm scared." Arizin turned towards the child with no sign of changing her mind. She put her index finger to her mouth, signaling for the girl to be quiet. Terrified, Lexi obeyed, swallowing her sobs. "You'll stay here now. I tried, but I'm not cut out to be a mother. I should never have gotten pregnant. You're still too young to understand the nuances of life. Goodbye," Arizin said. Lexi called out for her mother, but her voice was interrupted by sobs. Edson didn't care and turned away, abandoning her own daughter at the hospital. Now, in the hospital administration, the nurse watched through the cameras as the woman hurried out without the girl in her arms. Lexi, confused and scared, just kept asking, "Where's mommy? Where's my mommy?" And that was the question everyone was asking. The hospital administrator contacted Margaret Brown, who was identified in the records as the girl's paternal grandmother. The lady arrived at the hospital in 40 minutes. She looked frail and simple, but when she looked at her granddaughter, she smiled broadly. Lexi was visibly happy with her grandmother's presence, and she hugged her. As she had been under strong emotions for some time, the girl eventually fell asleep in her grandmother's arms. Margaret then asked the hospital administration where Edson was and what had happened, but no one could explain. Margaret thanked the attendants and apologized for it. She took the girl home and made sure Lexi would be well taken care of. There was a suggestion to involve the police, but Margaret assured it was unnecessary. However, as the grandmother and granddaughter left, Nurse Sophia couldn't help but worry about the situation. At home, Margaret took the girl to the room that once belonged to her son Corey Brown, Lexi's father. She let her granddaughter sleep in the bed and felt her eyes burn. She always got emotional when entering her son's room, who had died 2 years ago in a work accident. This tragedy made Margaret lose the taste for life for months, but it was for her granddaughter that she found the strength to face the grief. After all, the girl needed love and comfort more than ever, and Margaret knew Edson wasn't a mother with financial resources or the most affectionate. When her son started dating Arizin, Margaret soon realized that the daughter-in-law had none of her son's qualities. They had met at a charity event, and there Arizin learned of Corey's important position in the company. Margaret suspected that was the reason she had approached him, but she never wished ill on her son or daughter-in-law. For her, his happiness mattered more than her suspicions, and perhaps she was just overly protective of her only child. Now, in her living room, Margaret sipped on tea as she thought about how her daughter-in-law must be suffering from the loss of her husband and having to care for a child alone. To reach the point of abandoning her daughter, the woman must have been desperate and depressed. Margaret was almost certain of how she could help her daughter-in-law and granddaughter when she was surprised by the sound of the doorbell. Opening the door, she barely recognized Sophia in her nursing apron. Timidly, the woman explained that she had come to check if Lexi was okay. Margaret appreciated the gesture and invited her in for a cup of tea, which Sophia accepted. As they drank the hot, sweetened beverage, she looked at Margaret and asked if she could help with anything. Margaret smiled and explained that everything was fine and that Lexi was sleeping. Sophia nodded, and the lady continued, "Since my son passed away, things have been difficult. Arizin wasn't exactly a present mother, but I never imagined she'd be capable of abandoning her own daughter. It's so terrible that I can't even believe it happened." Intrigued, Sophia asked what the old lady would do from now on, to which she replied, "I'm going to visit my ex-daughter-in-law and tell her there's a solution. Despite her actions, she loves her daughter. She must just be lost and hopeless. My son left me something that can help her and bring her to her senses." Later that afternoon, Margaret headed to Arizin's house. Since she couldn't leave Lexi alone at home, the old lady was forced to take the girl with her. Sophia said her car wasn't the best, but she offered to drive them there. Margaret thanked her generosity and accepted. Thus, Sophia could stay outside the house with Lexi in the back seat. The three got into the car, and Sophia drove to the address given. It was in the outskirts of town, in a neighborhood full of seedy bars, brothels, and homeless people. Sophia drove until they reached a small, poorly maintained residence. It was Edson's house. Margaret asked Sophia to wait in the car with Lexi in the back seat, but far enough so that Arizin wouldn't even see them, and the woman did just that. Alone, Margaret approached the house and knocked on the door. There was no response, so she knocked again. After several attempts, the door finally opened. The smell of alcohol and cigarettes invaded Margaret's nostrils, making her grimace. There stood Arizin with disheveled hair and rubbing her eyes. She looked like someone who had just woken up. Upon seeing that it was Margaret, she expressed dissatisfaction. Arizin nodded for her mother-in-law to come in, which she did. Inside, Margaret asked Arizin if she was okay. The woman just laughed and drunkenly replied, "Of course I'm fine, Margaret. Why wouldn't I be?" Margaret was confused for a few seconds but persisted. "Arizin, we haven't developed an intimate relationship over time, but I know what you've done. You don't need to hide anything from me. I see that you're turning to alcohol to deal with your problems, but your daughter needs you, and I have something that can help you." Arizin looked surprised. "What are you talking about? I already said I'm fine. But whatever that girl did now doesn't matter anymore. She's not my problem anymore," she slurred. Margaret was shocked by her ex-daughter-in-law's behavior. Her intention there was to help her. After all, Margaret herself had faced dark moments after her son's departure. Initially concerned, Margaret now began to piece together the puzzle. "Is that why you abandoned Lexi at the hospital? Just to get rid of the girl?" she asked, surprised. Arizin looked at her mother-in-law disinterestedly. It was as if Margaret had said she forgot a sweater at the hospital instead of abandoning her own daughter. "Don't exaggerate, Margaret," was all Arizin said before flopping onto the sofa, massaging her temples. She then continued, "First of all, I never wanted to get pregnant, but your son insisted. I even thought it might help me in some way, but the idiot died before we even got married. That useless man left me nothing, just a daughter as unbearable as you." Margaret, stunned, opened her mouth to respond to her daughter-in-law, but ended up feeling her voice disappear. Arizin's disrespect was immense toward Margaret herself, her own daughter, and her late fiancé. Then the door of the house opened, and a scruffy-looking man entered. He opened his arms, and Arizin ran toward him, jumping into his embrace. The man grabbed her, and they kissed passionately. Margaret cleared her throat, signaling that she was still there. Edson then disengaged from the man's arms and said, "This is Margaret, my boyfriend." The man didn't even acknowledge the woman. He carried beers and headed to the kitchen. Margaret, astonished by it all, reinforced the question. "You still haven't explained to me why you abandoned Lexi at the hospital, Arizin." Arizin then replied, "Look, I don't even owe you any explanations. But if it'll get you off my back, I'll tell you. Sam and I need some time just for ourselves. We're dating, and couples like to date, you know? Your son was always so busy. So I needed someone to fulfill that need of mine." Feeling immense bitterness, Margaret said through gritted teeth, "Don't mention my son again, understood?" That's when Sam laughed and mocked, "Let the cuckold rest in peace, love. Now, please, ma'am, leave my house before I have to kick you out." Holding back tears with all her might, Margaret looked at Arizin, but the woman just stared back at her. That was confirmation. Margaret, feeling suffocated, headed for the door of the house and opened it. But before leaving, she turned to Arizin and said, "You won't harm Lexi anymore. I will get custody of my granddaughter. You don't know what you're missing out on." All Arizin replied was, "Do us all a favor and ask for custody of her. Good luck, Margaret." Unable to bear the situation any longer, Margaret closed the door and left the house. Her ex-daughter-in-law was truly a terrible person. Her suspicions had been confirmed in the worst possible way. She walked to Sophia's car and said, "Let's go. I don't want you to look in the direction of that house." Upon arriving home, Margaret sat down, breathing heavily, and Sophia served her water. Lexi went to play, and Sophia sat down to talk with Margaret. After recounting everything that had happened, Sophia crossed her arms and said, "Outrageous. That woman is despicable." Trying to calm down, Margaret looked at her granddaughter, who was playing on the floor. Suddenly, the girl turned to her grandmother and asked if she was sad. Margaret looked at her granddaughter and realized how incredible the resemblance was to her father. She had the same delicate features, and even at such a young age, she had her father's personality, always empathetic, caring for everyone. Margaret smiled and replied, "I'm fine, dear. And I'm even better because you're here." The girl then asked, "Is Mommy coming back?" Margaret thought about lying but decided to be honest with Lexi and replied, "Mommy thinks it's best for you to spend some time here with Grandma. What do you think?" The girl got up and gave her grandmother a long hug. Months went by, and Margaret fought for custody of the girl. It wasn't an easy task to convince the officials that the elderly woman was healthy and willing to care for a young child. Nurse Sophia worked hard to help the elderly woman in whatever she needed. It was she who performed all the exams Margaret needed to attach to the process, as well as driving the elderly woman to all the meetings and hearings. Sophia even testified on Margaret's behalf. The fact was that the nurse had grown attached to the two of them, especially to Lexi. Finally, after many signed documents and hearings, Margaret obtained custody of the girl. It was the first time the elderly woman shed tears of happiness since her son's death. While Lexi lived there, the days were happier. But the girl was about to face another tough challenge in life. Sophia started visiting Margaret and Lexi several times a week after her shift at the hospital. As a nurse, she also monitored Margaret's health, measuring her blood pressure and conducting routine exams. Everything was fine until the day Margaret felt unwell. Sophia took her to the hospital, where she received grave news. This was not a passing illness, she was sick. Doctors had found an advanced stage tumor, and Margaret was predicted to have only a few more weeks to live. Even though the situation was devastating, she was at peace, for she would reunite with her son. But her only concern was Lexi, who would go back to living with her mother or end up in an orphanage. Weeks passed, and Margaret's health deteriorated. At this point, Sophia had requested an early vacation from the hospital and began to care for the elderly woman and Lexi exclusively. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Sophia told Margaret something she felt in her heart. "Ms. Margaret, my husband and I always wanted children, but I can't conceive. We don't have luxuries and will need to work harder to cover new expenses. But the connection I've developed with Lexi is something I've never felt in my life. With your consent, I'd like to take care of Lexi when you're gone. She won't lack for love." Margaret felt truth in Sophia's words. After all, she had proven over all these months to be a hardworking and caring woman. Margaret thanked Sophia and said she would think about it. She would also ask Lexi what she thought about it. Finally, Margaret promised to give her answer soon. After all, she didn't have much time to lose. Even for days, Margaret locked herself in her room, writing something that no one knew what it was. On the day she finished, Margaret went to her late son's old room, now Lexi's, and knelt before the girl. "My daughter, Grandma is going to meet your daddy. Do you want me to give him any message?" The girl lowered her head and thought for a few seconds. Finally, she smiled and replied, "No need. I talk to him every day. He told me he's looking forward to seeing you." A tear fell from Margaret's eye, and she needed a few seconds to undo the knot in her throat. "Now you need to decide if you want to live with Sophia or Mommy," the elderly woman said, her voice trembling. "Will Mommy be sad if I choose Sophia?" the girl asked, embarrassed. "She won't, my dear," Margaret replied, hugging Lexi and letting the tears flow. That was the confirmation Margaret needed. "I'll love you forever, Grandma," the girl suddenly said, hugging Margaret, who said the same to the girl. The next day, Margaret didn't leave her room. She had left without giving an answer to Margaret about the girl's custody. Sophia was initially confused but decided to follow her heart. She packed a bag for Lexi and drove with the girl to her house. There, she would figure out what the next step would be. The house was simple but warm and cozy. While Sophia took care of Margaret's funeral over the phone in her room, her husband showed Lexi around the house, jokingly and with a lot of affection. 2 days later, the answer Sophia had been waiting for from Margaret arrived in the form of a letter, calming her anguish. The mailman rang, and a man in a suit introduced himself, saying he had been Margaret's son's lawyer in life and that Margaret had recently approached him. He handed Sophia 2 letters and a will and said he had promised the elderly woman that he would help the nurse with whatever she needed. Sophia was a little confused, and the man explained that one of the letters was for her and the other was for Arizin, Margaret's ex-daughter-in-law. The elderly woman was sure that Arizin would reappear as soon as she knew what was about to happen. The lawyer said goodbye and said he was at their disposal. Sophia barely closed the door and started to open the envelope, anxious. What she read in the letter made her heart race. In the text, Margaret explained that her son was a bright young man and worked for a multinational cargo transport company, but the accident he suffered at work prevented him from realizing his dreams. However, Margaret had received a generous compensation for her son's death and saved every penny, along with the savings she had made during her life, totaling $930,000, which now belonged entirely to that generous nurse who had helped her for months without receiving anything in return. Everything was duly described and signed in her will. The only thing she asked in return was that Sophia use the money to give Lexi a good life. Sophia had to sit down to believe what she was reading. For her, having custody of the girl was already the greatest wealth she had received in her life. Now, in addition to being able to give her love to Lexi, she would be able to provide the girl with a comfortable life, without financial stress. Sophia was immensely grateful but didn't understand why the inheritance hadn't been left in the girl's name. That's when Margaret's prediction came true. Days later, everything made sense. Arizin, Lexi's mother, found out everything and went to Sophia's house. She knocked on the door and took steps back, waiting for the nurse on the sidewalk. Arizin looked dejected as she had been abandoned by Sam. When attended by Sophia, Arizin said, "Where's my daughter? I'm taking her now. The girl inherited a fortune, didn't she? That bastard Sam will beg to get back with me now." Sophia didn't respond, just handed the letter to Arizin and said, "Margaret asked me to give you this." Excited, Arizin opened the envelope right there, thinking her future was settled. But she deflated with each sentence she read. "Arizin, if you're reading this letter, then my suspicion was always right about your character. You came back upon discovering my sons and my money. However, I trusted my intuition again and left everything to Sophia. Therefore, even if the unlikely happens and you in custody of Lexi after a long legal battle, you'll still have to support her with the sweat of your own work. And that's not what you want, I know. A daughter will interfere with your goal of meeting men who will support you. Now, have decency for once and disappear from my granddaughter's life. You are the worst example she could have as a person. Goodbye." Arizin swallowed hard and didn't understand how those words had such an effect on her, much more than she could have imagined. Enraged, she crumpled and tore up the letter as she walked away, shouting curses in Sophia's direction. Finally, Arizin left without even caring to see her daughter one last time. Sophia, her husband, and Lexi moved to a larger house close to a school and recreational areas. Lexi still didn't understand many of life's nuances, but as she grew older, she would understand how lucky she was to be abandoned at that hospital. When she was a child, it was the only way her grandmother was well cared for in her final moments, and Lexi could find her true mother. And not a night went by that Sophia didn't silently thank Margaret before closing her eyes in bed. If you liked the story, please leave a like on the video, and this other story that is appearing on the screen now will probably touch you as well. Enjoy the session, and see you in the next video.